right, Alisha, let's play a game, shall we?
I love games.
Okay. I am going to give you a list of clues, i.e., things about a person.
Okay.
And I want you to try to tell me who you think it is.
Oh, yeah. She didn't tell me who her story was on today, so I'm excited. Okay. Ready, go.
Lifelong criminal,
Yes.
serial killer,
Okay.
rapist, suspected necrophiliac, pedophile, Canadian.
What's his name? Paul Blart guy.
No,
What's
but
his name?
Paul Blart. No, that's close. So this guy I'm going to
Paul
talk
Bernardo.
This guy I'm going to talk about today is actually described as possibly being worse than him. They're the two that are most often referred to as the monsters of Canada. The guy I'm going to talk about today is Clifford Olson, and people call him the Beast of BC.
Oh, intriguing. I don't think I know this story.
I didn't know him either. So it actually came to be, we started talking to Mitzi Soretto, the author, and planning a meet and greet with her and going and checking out her new book. And she sent a copy. So I decided to read it thinking it'd be great if they covered a Pacific Northwest serial killer in the book. Then I can use it for a case. And I find this guy and I had no idea. I don't think, maybe I've heard bits and pieces, but I don't think I ever put it all together as the same person. This guy's life is one of extreme escalations. As a child, he was considered very quick-witted and had a criminal mind. And I honestly got a lot of Tommy Lynn Sells vibes from him, not because Tommy was technically referred to as not very smart. It wasn't that. It was that they couldn't nail down what the motive was. It was simply they wanted to do
doing
this
it for the sake of doing it.
They wanted it. Yeah, they wanted to inflict pain and they wanted to do it. It's always like you don't know who they're after, who their victim's going to be.
It definitely becomes more monster-like because
Right.
it's not, oh, it was a moment of passion or connected to something else just because I wanted to.
Absolutely. And the other thing they had in common was the victims weren't always very similar, right? With Tommy Lynn Sells, he was going for anybody he wanted to. This guy, while there was some similarities, it was a mix of genders, ages.
So you don't get an MO, it's harder to
Exactly.
follow.
It's hard to put it together, and we're going to get into that today. I'll tell you what. I do want to say before I dive in that this is a rough case. So if you have a hard time listening to violence against children, this may not be the episode for you. And we get that. We totally understand. But we have plenty of stuff out there for you to listen to. So we will not be offended if you have to skip ahead. Clifford Robert Olson Jr. was born January 1st, 1940. He was born to unwed parents, Clifford Sr. and Leona, and they did eventually get married and raised Clifford together in Edmonton, Canada. Clifford's father was a former army man and eventually became a milkman. And while the Cliffords weren't a family of crime, he seemed to be born with a proclivity for crime. Even at a young age, Clifford learned the art of the scam. At the tender age of 4, his family took delight in some of his tactics. When hearing that his mother and uncles mentioned they were out of beer, he offered to solve the problem for them. He asked, "What could I get from you if I can find you a beer?" And they told him, "We'd give you $1." This sounded like a great idea, so he went down to the basement, found some empty bottles, filled them with water, hammered some caps back on them, and came back upstairs and handed them over. So they give him $1. And as the uncles take a sip, they realize it's water. And rather than get mad at him, they just laugh and they let him keep the money.
That's pretty clever.
It's pretty clever. So around the same age, he reflects on another incident which isn't very amusing, and that is how his 15-year-old uncle used to make him and his cousin take their clothes off, lay on the bed, and he would lay on top of them. So he said there was never any penetration, but the uncle was clearly using them as a tool.
Right.
And in order to keep them quiet, he would give them nickels. And basically what Clifford learned from these types of things in his life was that breaking the rules filled his pockets. He always had money if he was willing to do these things. As he grew up, he had troubles at school. He was held back a few times. He stole from anyone. I mean, I'm talking grandma, grandpa, friends, family, even a blind street vendor who would rely on him to give him proper change. He would go and rob him all the time. He leveraged his knowledge of his father's job as a milkman to sneak after other milkmen and steal their money and also the money left on the porch for them when people were waiting for their milk each morning. He knew where his dad would hide the money, so he would go into other people's carts and take that out. There wasn't a day that went by where this guy wasn't thinking about the fast way to get some cash. There's another disturbing incident from when he was a child where he tricked another kid to get inside of an oven and then he lit a fire underneath it. And this was purely out of curiosity to see what would happen. And luckily a neighbor heard the kid's muffled cries and came out and ended it. But it was just kind of sealing the idea that stealing wasn't all that he was interested in. He was looking for the next thing.
Yeah, and if I'm getting a thrill from breaking these rules, well, I can break bigger rules, and that'd be even more exciting.
Right. What am I going to get if I do this? So even with the incident with his uncle, Clifford didn't appear to have the same kind of issues we see with other serial killers. There was no sign that he ever had a head injury. His mother wasn't overbearing to him. In fact, as he aged, he was the dominant one in the relationship, and their entire life together, they remained very close. By his teens, Clifford was an established thief who began a long career of being arrested and going to jail. So this is going to blow your mind. You ready for this?
Ready.
Looking at his life, he spent the vast majority of it in jail. In fact, there were only 4 years of his adult life that he was free.
From ages
18 to 71. 4 years. That's it.
Whoa.
Yeah.
And I'm guessing he did a lot of damage in those 4 years that you're going to touch on.
He sure did, but most of it was done in a very quick span of time, which we'll get into. Trust me. So between the time of 1957 and 1981, he was arrested a total of 94 times. And early in his prison career, from 57 to 68, he escaped prison 7 times, gaining him the nickname the Rabbit, because he was always quick and he was always getting away. Now, he managed to get away several different ways, but one standard that worked for him a couple of times really stood out to me, and that was fooling the medical personnel. So one time, Olsen complains of a stomach ache, and they give him a cup to get a urine sample, and he pricks his own finger, puts blood in it so that he can fudge having a kidney issue. So they send him to the hospital, and as he's going to the hospital, that's how he gets away from the guard.
I wish people that are that clever would use their powers for good.
I know, really seriously. CEOs, right? So most of the time, Clifford was caught within 2 months of each escape. He either reoffended and was rearrested, or somebody caught him. One time they had search dogs go after him in the woods, and he got sick of hiding under leaves and actually was like, here I am. During his escapes, he would resume stealing for money and also to meet women. And at least 2 times he got women pregnant during these excursions. He always tried to leverage a relationship with a woman in a way to get parole early. So he would say things like, oh, I want to get married. I have this newfound maturity. I want to start a family, or I need to go to college. Even in prison, Clifford found ways to practice fraud. And this one I cannot wrap my mind around. I keep thinking about how this happened. So at one point, he manages to get near a file cabinet where they keep arrest warrants. He finds his arrest warrant and he basically whites out the magistrate's name on the paperwork. And then he has a friend with good handwriting write in another magistrate that he happened to know the name of. He photocopies it, gets rid of the old one, so then there's only one copy. And then by the time he gets to court, they notice the mistake and he says, well, this isn't valid. If there's a mistake, I should be let out. So, of course, the judge was like, no, we'll get a new warrant. This isn't the end of the world. But, I mean, it shows you what kind of lengths he would go to get out of prison, even though he was only out for so many years.
Also, couldn't you just I mean, I don't know how all that documentation works, but couldn't you just throw it away or something? Or
well, he did after he photocopied one. He wanted to have one there.
Okay.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know his reasonings. So on February 1977, Olsen found himself a free man again, and on the 11th of the month, he had been released from the BC penitentiary. Now, this was because of a questionable Canadian law, and I think other people question it, but I definitely question it, is that any prisoner with sentences less than 25 years get released after doing 2/3 of their time. And this is basically due to overcrowding and other reasons, but they're just let go.
That's strange. You would think they would then just change the mandatory to be 2/3.
I know.
It sounds really serious, but you'll get out sooner.
So prior to this release, he did tell them he wanted to be a student at Fraser Valley College. And at this point in his life, he was ready to go find his fiancee, Stephanie, and start a family. So they let him out. And instead of going to school, he does go back to Karamios, where his fiancee, Stephanie, had lived. And when he gets there, he realizes she had moved. So he finds a guy to drive him because he doesn't have a license. And he offers him $20 and some beer to take him to the airport where he can get a plane to go find Stephanie. Well, as they're driving, he notices a girl sitting on a hill, and it looks like a young girl. So he says, "Oh, back this up. I want to go talk to her." Debbie was newly 23, but looked all but 12 years old to Clifford Olsen. She had been hitchhiking and fell in with some people she had met along the way, and the night before they had been partying. She was pretty positive someone had slipped something in her drink, something she thought might be LSD, so she decided to leave the party and be alone because she was feeling confused and not like herself. So she now finds herself sitting in the rain on a hillside just beside the highway, and she hears someone calling out to her. And as she looks down, she sees a man with dark hair hanging out of a car window talking to her. He's offering her a ride because she's sitting there in the rain, and she decides to get in because he looks harmless. In fact, she noted that he was attractive. Something about Debbie called out to Olsen, and he knew he had to have her. Within minutes, he offered her money, handed her a beer, and offered to buy her some food. Not long after, Olsen had John drive him and Debbie to a hotel to drop them off. He checked in, and John went on his way. Once they were alone in the hotel room together, Debbie essentially went to sleep. She was definitely under the influence, and Olsen used this to his advantage. He had sex with her barely conscious body, and later, Debbie would recall not remembering any of it. Olsen liked to ply women with pills. He had given Debbie chloral hydrate, also known as hypnotic, something he was given for insomnia while he was in prison. Pills for sex would be something you could consider a theme throughout his entire life, and this was just the beginning. Not long after his new relationship with Debbie, Olsen reached out to his fiancée, Stephanie, and set up a time to meet. The three of them, yes, the three of them, met up, and despite Stephanie's initial reluctance, they all got a room together.
Wait, three meaning?
Him, his fiancée, and Debbie, this girl he picked up along the way. So they get a room, and they even share a bed together. And Debbie slept right through Olsen having sex with Stephanie. And the next day, Stephanie basically gave him an ultimatum. She said, "It's me or it's this new girl, Debbie." And he explained that Debbie was just for sex. He loved only Stephanie, but he was not ready to give her up. So Stephanie, likely making the best decision of her life, left him. But now Debbie is alone with a man she would soon loathe.
And Debbie's on board, so she doesn't realize that she was drugged and raped.
She's drugged
Oh,
up
she's
the entire
continually
time.
drugged, so she's just kind of like...
He's giving her booze. He's giving her pills. She's a very
Okay.
small girl.
Okay.
He's keeping her compliant, basically training her.
Right.
Olsen took Debbie from hotel to hotel and began a steady cycle of pills and sex with an unconscious girl. In between, Debbie describes confusing and often scary behavior, suggesting that Olsen was more than one person. His personality would shift on a dime. If Debbie didn't comply with his odd requests, he would beat her all over her body. He was asking her to take frequent baths where he would wash and condition her hair, shave her pubic hair, and apply lotion and baby oil to her body. And even one occasion, she noted that he urinated on her while she was sat in the bath. Once she tried to call for help out of the window of the hotel, and he slapped her and told her that he was in the mafia and alluded to himself and his brothers going after her family if she tried it again. He then began sleeping with a large knife next to him in the bed to intimidate her into submission.
So she's just full on kidnapped at this point.
Yep.
Can't do anything.
It's horrific. After days of feeding her pills and garnering her compliant, Olsen took Debbie to a bar to meet up with another couple. They proceeded to have dinner together, and Olsen berated her, being abusive and mean to Debbie, calling her names. The other male took Olsen aside to chide him about his behavior, and the woman leaned into Debbie and said, "You really shouldn't date Clifford Olsen." Debbie didn't realize it at the time, but the woman had been a previous lover of Olsen's. The couple ended up leaving them at the restaurant, and Olsen and Debbie drove around for a bit in a taxi before ultimately ending up at the woman's house. While she didn't seem enthusiastic to see them, she allowed them to stay there, and eventually they moved in for a short time. Debbie began to realize that there was some sort of relationship between the two of them, but she was kind of pleased that maybe it would distract him and she would get some time away from Olsen. But of course, that night, she woke up to him sneaking into her bed and forcing her to have sex with him. After the ordeal, she went into the living room the next day and found the woman having breakfast with her children. She now knew this woman to be called Sharon. She had been crying, and Sharon asked her if Olsen had hurt her, and she said that he had, and Sharon took Debbie to a doctor. But rather than get her out of the situation, he wrote her a prescription for tranquilizers. It's now been weeks and the ordeal is continuing. Sharon is trying to help, though. So she finds a German couple named Gunter and Gisela Kleinschmidt. And this is a Christian couple who believed really heavily in rehabilitation, and they would take people in who were, fresh out of jail or trying to turn their lives around, and they would let them live with them while they helped them along with this process. So they agree to take her in, and Olsen is very upset. He is so mad at Sharon for doing this under his nose, and he goes on the hunt for her. So he locates this service called Burden Bearers that helped Sharon place Debbie in their home. And he goes there and he convinces the secretary to give him Debbie's new address, which she does. So he then goes to this house of the Kleinschmidts and begins wooing them. So he can be very charismatic. He's telling them about how he loves dogs because he sees a dog in their house. And he has a very kind demeanor, and he's really trying to repent for his criminal ways. And they like him a lot. So they offer him a job and he moves in with them. So now Debbie's tormentor is living with her again and constantly sneaking into her room to rape her. At one point, Olsen even catches her in their sauna, writing in lipstick that Olsen is attacking her, trying to tell the Kleinschmidts, but he catches her and gets rid of it. Soon, Debbie is totally defeated and she starts acting out. In church, she's acting like the devil is speaking through her. She makes attempt after attempt to escape, going to neighbors' doors, making a scene, knocking on the doors. Cops are called, and of course the Kleinschmidts are explaining from their perspective, we're trying to help her. This girl is obviously sick. We're trying to make a home for her. And finally, she ends up getting away. So as the three of them, Olsen and the Kleinschmidts, are running after her, she flags down a truck driver and says, they're trying to kidnap me, and he lets her in, and off she goes back home to Edmonton with her mom. But even though Debbie's safe at home with her mom, her life is still in turmoil. She begins years and years of therapy. And even later in life, fast forward to after this whole ordeal is over, Clifford calls her and tries to meet her after she's gotten over this initial trauma and is moving on with her life. He basically is making her a victim again by calling her. And he told interviewers that he had intended to kill her. Had she said, yes, I'll meet you, he would have killed her.
And for her, you're finally home and away after all that time feeling, I mean, I can't even begin to think how she was feeling, but like you're going crazy. Like you're telling all these people, help me, help me, help me. And everyone's going, oh, she needs treatment. It's okay. So am I actually crazy?
Yeah,
so to finally get home and to have this
it's like
guy
gaslighting.
Basically hunt you down.
Absolutely. Later that year, Olsen was again arrested and had his freedom revoked for charges of fraud, scams, theft, you name it. So continued his saga of arrest, release, arrest, release, arrest. When he was out in society, he was stealing or being beat up for trying to molest children. He would rob senior citizens and hitchhikers, and at one point, he met a woman who had a 7-year-old daughter, and they began a relationship. When he was left alone with the daughter, he started grooming her to be someone that he could take advantage of. Not much long after meeting them, he had convinced the mother to allow him to take nude photographs of her and her daughter. This soon grew into him molesting her, as well as molesting her friends. He would offer candy and toys to make them more compliant. Finally, the mother caught on to this and stopped letting him around them, thank goodness, and he left and went to Sydney, Nova Scotia, literally moments onto Nova Scotia soil. He found a child at a playground and lured her away with him. So he's hand in hand talking to another 7-year-old walking down the street, and a police officer pulls up. Now, the police officer asks, who's this child? He tells him it's my niece. So he asks for identification, and he's like, well, it's at the hotel with my wife. So the officer asks, okay, get in my car. We'll go to the hotel and you can show me. So they get to the hotel and they're in the room, and he's like, my wife's in the restaurant. And he goes and he takes off and then he escapes. But the officer's there with all his stuff. So I can only imagine that he saw the nude photographs of a child because a warrant was issued on sexual assault charges. Of course, nothing came from them and they were dropped.
And I'm assuming the little girl was reunited with whomever.
Oh,
she
yeah.
was
The
with at
officer was like, no, she can stay here. You're coming with me, bud. Olsen continued his life of crime, supporting himself with the money he stole from unsuspecting victims, whether duped into giving him cash or giving him access to their traveler's checks, or he was stealing their belongings. His escapades took him to the United States, where he traveled through New York, Illinois, Louisiana, and Florida. But he worked his way back up north, where he was eventually caught in Alberta and brought in on charges of possessing stolen property as well as for his prison escapes. And he ended up being sentenced to 2 years and 9 months in prison. Back in lockup, Olsen resumed his favorite prison pastime, writing appeals and trying to get out early. He was also filing complaints that he was being mistreated. In one of his appeals, he noted that while he was escaped, his charges had actually been dropped from him. So technically, he shouldn't have been in prison in the first place. So why would he get busted for escaping? So the judge actually thought this was kind of funny and reduced his sentence.
It's pretty clever. And that's the beauty of our judicial system is, well, in Canada's, I suppose, of just
It's probably similar.
the flaws.
Yeah. So he did have to stay there. He wasn't let out immediately, but they did reduce his time. But while he was there, he learned a couple of new tricks: snitching and raping. In 1978, while back in prison, he was moved into the super maximum unit. This is where he met a man who was in prison for killing a child, and his name was Gary Francis Marcoux. 9-year-old Jean Duve had disappeared and was found sexually assaulted and murdered. Marcoux had been seen with the child the day prior and was arrested for the crime. While in prison, the two struck up a friendship of sorts, and Marcoux told Olsen he needed an alibi. Olsen considered this and told him he might be able to help him, but in exchange, he needed every detail about what happened so that he could fabricate a believable story. Marcoux couldn't believe his luck, and he agreed to tell him everything. Olsen had him provide the details, and over the course of 10 days, Marcoux gave him a 4-page letter detailing what happened to the girl, the method of the murder, descriptions of clothing, and even maps of the location. All of this was done in his own handwriting. And in the writings, he mentioned that he took the little girl on a June night, purchased rope, found a remote spot by Weaver Lake where he raped her and tied her to a tree naked where he was going to leave her to die. While she was tied up, he wiped the car down for fingerprints. And while he was wiping the car down, he claims the girl strangled herself in the rope as she struggled to get away.
Believable. Also, if you're interested in how someone committed a crime, maybe don't take the advice from the person that's now serving time for that crime in prison.
Maybe. We'll see.
Just a thought.
Initially, he offered his services as an alibi, claiming that he was with the man and it was during a temporary release from prison. But then quickly, he turned on him and decided, I'm going to turn this into the RCMP. Copies of the affidavit and interview were sent to prosecutor Bob Shantz, and this was a relationship that he would form with Olsen that would be of a mutual benefit. It wouldn't be the first time that the two would work together. Not only did the relationship with Bob play a large importance in Olsen's life, but the information that Olsen received from Marcoux seemed to shape who he would become as a criminal. Many speculated that Marcoux actually became a teacher to young Olsen, who had merely been a thief at this point. Olsen established himself as someone who would squeal on other inmates. This actually didn't make him very popular, as you can imagine.
Weird.
That didn't seem to bother him, though. On one occasion, he described how inmates tried to kill him. While most inmates would keep their head down and not ruffle any feathers, Olsen requested protection and made statements against his fellow inmates, some of which even got a few of them extra time. This may have made a lot of people fearful of him, but either way, he didn't care. It seemed like it was only important to him that he could get out of prison sooner. He learned that snitches didn't really get stitches, they actually got out early. Less than a year later, Olsen was on another stretch of freedom. It was 1980, and he was making a living for himself by stealing, naturally. Olsen would steal items and sell them for a profit, or he would steal them, get a receipt, and return them. So sometimes he would buy the exact same thing that someone else is buying, get the receipt so he could return it for money. It's incredible. He has explained that he assumes he was stealing about $1 million worth of goods a year. Like, that's bonkers. I'm sure he's exaggerating, but
he was that prolific, that constant.
He was very careful not to repeat stores too often so they wouldn't catch on to him. He'd basically go down the highway and just hit certain stores. One night, Olsen went out for evening drinks at a hotel bar and met a couple of women who were best friends, Kathy Wilson and Joan Berryman. Olsen bought drinks for the two in the hopes of betting Kathy. But when she said she needed to get home to her kids, he decided to switch it up and go for her friend Joan. He convinces Kathy to leave Joan with him, and he rents a hotel room and gets her pretty intoxicated, and they end up sleeping together. Now, she's really embarrassed by this because it's the first man she's been with since her husband, who she was married to for, I think, 21 years. And she doesn't even really know his name. But that didn't stop them from moving their relationship to the next step pretty fast. Within 4 days, Olsen was moved into her house, and she was fully smitten with him. Now, he was, of course, there for money and sex, but she was loving how he was treating her. In the beginning, he was flattering her, being attentive, giving her things. So it moved pretty fast. Eventually, she was divorced and got a settlement check for, I think, $28,000, and he had convinced her to sign it over to him. Being with Olsen meant more than a normal relationship. Soon, she was posing for nude photos, and he was inviting her adult daughter over with her friends to hotel parties where he would also take nude photos of them. Joan would eventually find these photos and become very upset, but she just didn't want to give up on him. She knew that he would have sex with other people, including young boys and girls, but she just didn't want to give up the idea of a family with him. He eventually turned his abuse towards Joan. He would hit her and say cruel things. He'd threaten her life on multiple occasions. So she learned to stop protesting his lifestyle and be more submissive in their relationship.
Oh, that's so sad.
By July of 1980, Joan was pregnant with Olsen's child, and his reactions were of happiness and joy. He was very excited. And the impending birth of his own child was not going to stop him from doing the things he liked to do, which was luring children to his home to rape them. Christine Weller was 12 years old and lived with her mother, father, and grandmother. At her young age, she had witnessed plenty of fights between her parents, and there was usually alcohol involved. On 2 occasions, she remembered seeing her father threaten her mother with a gun and a knife. Her home life could be scary, which led her to attempt to run away several times. She always came back, just like her parents always came back to each other after separating. The 3 of them lived on and off with Grandma in the Bonanza Motel off of the King George Highway in Surrey. Most of the time, Christine stayed there with her grandmother alone, as her parents' relationship was always teetering on the edge. Making friends was difficult when you were poor and often wore dirty clothes to school. She became a target who was picked on. But Christine was athletic and cute, and she had worse things to worry about at home. One day after school, she was hanging out with one of her new friends she had made in Surrey, Clive Walker. He was nice to her and let her borrow his bike. It was on that bike that she had her last conversation with her father. On November 17th, 1980, Christine rode her bike alongside her dad, who was headed to the bar to get a drink. He asked her where she got the bike, and she said a friend was letting her borrow it, and he told her to be careful of that boy. Once they got to the bar, her father gave her a kiss goodbye and told her to head home. That evening, Clifford Olson was driving across King George Highway right after a fight with his wife Joan and spotted the young Christine riding on her friend Clive's bike. This is when Clifford employed a tactic he would use frequently on his intended victims. He rolled down his window and hollered at the girl to inquire if she knew where the unemployment office was, because he was looking to hire kids. Christine drew closer and pointed out that it was down the street. And Olsen started inquiring about her life, how old she was, if she had a boyfriend, and what her parents did. Eventually, he offered to give her father a job and suggested that he could even hire her for $10 an hour. Now, that was unheard of because at the time, minimum wage was barely over $3. After he made some progress getting her to trust him and identifying her as a child with a questionable home life, he offered her a beer. She leaned her borrowed bike up against the building they stood next to, the Surrey Animal Hospital, and she got into the car. According to Olsen, Christine told him all about her life, including the kids at school that were mean to her, and she had recently even been forced to have sex with multiple boys at a party. The two were with each other in the car for a few hours, drinking all of the beers. Olsen made a quick stop at his home to see if Joan had returned, and when he saw that she hadn't, he grabbed his chloral hydrate pills and went back out to the car with Christine. She mentioned to him that she was feeling drunk, so he gave her some vodka and orange juice and offered her 2 pills. The pills, he explained, were, quote, wake-up pills, and that would help counter the effects of the alcohol and help her to wake up. They would, of course, have the opposite effect, but she didn't know that, so she took them. Olsen drove Christine to a remote area so that he could have sex with her. On their way to where Christine would be alive for the last time, Olsen passed police, filled his gas, and even stopped to buy burgers at the local Denny's. Yet no one stopped a grown man with a drunk 12-year-old in his car. Eventually, he found a quiet spot in a field off of River Road, a place where he had taken kids before, and he told her to get into the back and sleep it off. Eventually, she would fall asleep, and he would undress the inebriated girl and have unconsensual sex with her. It was now well past midnight, and Olsen found himself wondering what he was going to do. He decided to head back to the apartment, but found that his car was stuck in the mud of the field. After trying to get it out for over an hour, he decided he couldn't take the girl back home, and he needed to get rid of the problem. He took the laces out of her shoes and held them around her neck. She was passed out from the alcohol and pills, so she didn't fight him. He strangled her with the laces for several minutes, having to try over and over to get a good grip. It wasn't working. He resorted to covering her mouth and nose, but again, he couldn't succeed. He tried the laces again, putting all of his strength into it, but they eventually ended up snapping. He dragged her to some blackberry bushes and stabbed her 10 times in her chest, neck, and abdomen. After Olsen murdered Christine, he took her things and began to destroy them. He cut up her clothes and shoved them into a sleeping bag he had in the car and threw them into the river, and then he burned her ID. The jewelry she was wearing was now shoved into his pockets. He would get rid of that later. He took off his own shirt, got it wet, and wiped down the car for fingerprints. He put a fresh shirt on that he had stored in the trunk, and then went on his way to go to a local motel where he could get help getting his car out. When Christine didn't show up at school, Clive thought she might be sick, so he decided he better go get his bike before his dad got mad. Eventually, his father, Alex Walker, asked about the bike, and he had to tell him that he loaned it to Christine. They went together to the Bonanza Hotel to see if they could get it back, but no one answered the door. After a few days, Clive and Alex went back to the Wellers and realized that she hadn't been around for days, but nobody seemed concerned. She was written off as a runaway since she had done it before. Though Christine's family didn't seem worried, Alex was, so he alerted the crisis center, but again, they told him she was labeled a runaway. In fact, they were already considering her for foster care because of her home life. This didn't sit well with Alex, so he complained to a friend at the provincial legislature. Hopefully, they could make some progress filing a missing report. That seemed to do the trick, and reports went out, but again, nothing much happened, and no one seemed to be caring about Christine. On Christmas Day, a man named Bill Andrew was taking a long walk along the Fraser River when he passed by a bush that looked a little bit odd. He thought maybe he spotted a mannequin or a dummy, but what he found was the body of 12-year-old Christine Weller. The fighting had been bad and she was staying with his mother, so he went to her in Coquitlam and turned his charms on her. She forgave him immediately. After all, she was pregnant with his child and wanted to start a family. And in the weeks prior to the discovery of Christine's body, they had gone to Hawaii together to reconcile. A week after the discovery of Christine's body, Olsen met a 17-year-old girl named Kim, who he decided to sodomize. When she went home to her boyfriend, he beat her for being with another man. She then went to the police to report that Olsen had raped her. Olsen was charged with rape, buggery, and indecent assault. He was put in jail without an option for bail. Olsen reached out to his prosecutor friend, Bob Shantz, who he told that he believed she was lying about him, so Shantz decided to take him on as a client. Now, when Shantz looked into Kim, he realized that she had been working as a sex worker, so of course he targeted her credibility, and the charges against Olsen were eventually dropped. In a disgusting turn of events, A warrant ended up going out on Kim because she failed to show up to court to testify against him on a weapons charge. First, he needed new chloral hydrate pills for his insomnia, so he headed to the doctor. Then he needed to prepare for the birth of his child. While Joan was in the hospital, Clifford suggested that he could drive a 12-year-old named Susie over for a visit with Joan and the new baby. Now, Joan had struck up a friendship with Susie because she lived in the same apartments, and while she was pregnant, she was home a lot. So on the way, of course, he stopped to rape the child. In return for her silence, he gave her money and took her to the hospital where she could hold the baby. When back at home, he then had Susie's little sister, Anna, over. Anna was 8 years old. He suggested that the child help him put some stickers on the bathtub, and while in there, he sexually assaulted her and again offered her money for her silence. Olsen visited, cuddled with the baby, and would head home in the evening. On one trip home, April 15th, 1981, he noticed a young girl outside of a gas station. Colleen Daigneault was a 13-year-old shy girl who had separated parents and lived with her grandmother, Julie. She had been visiting a friend and was on her way home late that night. Olsen pulled into the gas station where she had been standing and introduced himself to the young girl. He asked where the employment office was and said he was hiring kids to wash windows for $10 an hour. He asked her if she was interested in a job, and she replied that she'd have to ask her grandmother. But she did get into his car. Olsen offered her a beer and handed her 2 of his chloral hydrate pills. Colleen was soon passed out in the back seat of Olsen's car. He took her out to a logging road where he climbed into the back with her, undressed her, and had sex with her. Once he was done, he took a hypodermic syringe that he had stolen from the doctor's office that week and tried to inject air into Colleen's artery. He missed 3 times and realized that he was not going to be able to kill her that way. Instead, he put her back in her clothes, drove to a forested area, and after sleeping for a few hours, he tried to wake her up. She was still fairly drowsy, so he had sex with her again and promised her that he would take her home. He suggested that they take a walk on a trail into the woods. As he distracted Colleen, he took out a hammer and hit her in the back of the head. He covered her with leaves and branches and left her there and threw her shoes into the woods, and then headed back to the hospital to visit his wife and newborn child. 21 days after Olsen abducted, sexually assaulted, and murdered Colleen, her grandmother reported her missing. She told police that she had assumed she had been at a friend's house the entire time. Police thought the child had run away to find her mother. Everyone seemed rather unconcerned with her disappearance. The day that Grandma reported her granddaughter missing to police, a 16-year-old Darren Johnsrud was out running errands for his family, picking up dry cleaning and supplies for his mother from the Shoppers Drug Mart. He was in town to visit his mother and her husband for the Easter holiday. He lived with his father, so he was only in town for the weekend. Darren was known to be a handful, often lashing out at his younger sister and doing drugs with his friends. For 3 weeks, he had even run away from home and lived on the streets before returning. But things seemed to be getting better for the family. That was until Darren crossed paths with Clifford Olsen. Per usual, Olsen offered Darren a job, and he was quick to accept it and hop in the car. He gave Darren alcohol and pills and drove him out to the Fraser River. By the time they parked, Darren was already unconscious. He stripped the child, sodomized him several times before leading him out to the riverbank. There he took out his hammer and hit him on the side of the head. Darren was not dead, and he asked him what he was doing, so he took out the hammer and hit him 2 more times, breaking his jaw and eventually killing him. History repeated itself, and Olsen again got his car stuck. He had to walk out to a local farm to inquire about using a tractor to pull his car out. Once his car was freed, he took Darren's clothes and the hammer and tossed them into the river. He then again changed clothes that he had in his trunk and took the car to be cleaned. Darren's family was immediately concerned when he didn't return home. Police initially thought that he had been a runaway, but he was only there for 2 days, so the family thought that that was not the case. They began to worry when they found out that other children in the area had also disappeared. May 2nd, 2 members of a local retriever dog club were out working with their dogs at the river. Suddenly, one of the dogs froze and was indicating at something near the riverbank. They went to take a look and discovered a boy's body draped over a tree stump. They called police, who then reached out to Darren's family, asking them to provide his dental records. They initially called to tell them the records were not a match, only to have to call back days later and admit they made a mistake and that the body was Darren.
It's terrible.
I know. I can't imagine that. At this point, none of these murders were linked together. This was due to the genders being different, a variety of murder methods. In fact, detectives were actually pursuing Darren's stepfather as a suspect. They claimed that he seemed to not like the boy very much and even quoted him as calling him promiscuous and homosexual. While Olsen's name appeared on a long list of potential suspects in the area because he had an arrest record, they never discovered that a farmer had to help him pull his car out of that area, a clue that would have put him at the top of the list. Check out what we're listening to this week.
Do you love true crime? Do you love the 90s? Well, I've got a brand new true crime podcast for you called 90s Crime Time. I'm your host, Simone, and on this show, you'll hear cases from theft to kidnapping to murder, all from this great decade of 1990 to 1999. Unlike the O.J. Simpson trial, the Columbine High School massacre, and the Oklahoma City bombing, on this show, I'd like to focus on lesser-known 90s crime cases that did not make much, if any, national news. You'll hear cases such as the murder of Sharice Iverson, the death of Tommy Burke, the Stardust Casino robbery, the murder of Diane Nash, and others. On 90s Crime Time, you're more than likely going to be amazed at just how many violent crimes occurred during this time period. Scorned lovers, serial killers, and baby killers were just some of the types of murderers that committed grisly crimes throughout the 90s. I will warn you, some of these crimes I will talk about may make you sad, angry, or maybe even a little scared. Listener discretion is always advised, and I hope that you'll tune in every Wednesday and Thursday for a brand new episode of 90s Crime Time. You can find 90s Crime Time on Apple Podcast, Spotify, Stitcher, and iHeartRadio. You can also find 90s Crime Time on social media apps such as Instagram, Twitter, and Tumblr. I'd love for you to take a listen, maybe follow, and maybe leave a rating or two. Don't forget to tell your friends and family about 90s Crime Time, and I'll see you soon on the show.
Mere days after the positive identification of Darren's body, Clifford Olsen married the mother of his 1-month-old child, Joan. On May 19th, Olsen was driving when he spotted a tall young girl hitchhiking near the mall. He pulled up to her to inquire where she was headed. He told her he happened to be going to the same place and offered her a ride. Sandra Lynn Wolfsteiner was 16 years old and lived with her sister Susan in Langley. She needed a ride to Langley, where she intended to have lunch with her older boyfriend. She was interested in moving out and needed a job, so cue Olsen letting her know that he owned his own construction companies and happened to be hiring girls to wash windows for $10 an hour. He also stepped up his game. He said he could rent her a $500 apartment for just over $100. This was very appealing to Sandra, so she asked when she could move in, and he said, "How about this weekend?" To celebrate, he had her reach in the back of the car and grab some beers. They headed over to Sandra's bank so she could withdraw money that she had saved up so she could put a deposit on the new apartment. When she returned, Olsen handed her his wake-up pills, and then they drove out to Cultus Lake outside of Chilliwack. He told her that he needed to stop by his cabin and grab some tools. So as the girl stepped out of the car, Olsen grabbed his hammer and followed behind her. As she walked ahead of him, he brought the hammer down and hit her in the back of the head. As she fell, she was still aware of what was happening. He hit her again as she tried to defend herself. After the second hit, she was no longer moving but was still breathing. He then proceeded to rape her. He went to the car to get her money that she had withdrawn to steal it and realized she hadn't taken any money out of the bank. She had been lying. So he got very mad and decided to rape her body again and then covered her with branches and leaves. She was still breathing when he left her in the woods and started to dispose of the evidence. Sandy's boyfriend had waited for her at lunch. When she didn't show up, he called her mother to ask about her. He then realized nobody knew where she was, so he called the police. Police told the man that they weren't going to take a missing person report for a full 48 hours. Sandra was older, so many people didn't seem very fast to follow up on these kinds of things. They did suspect that the boyfriend had something to do with it if she did disappear, so they asked him to take a polygraph. I don't really know whatever happened with the polygraph, but about a month later, someone who knew Sandy told police that they had actually seen her and talked to her, so the search was not pursued. Not long after the attack on Sandy, Olsen attacked a girl named Jackie, and he agreed to let her go if she didn't tell the police. But he did steal her money, but ultimately did let her go. He dropped her, I think, at an arcade down the street. Now, the minute she was dropped off, she went directly to the police to tell them what happened. And unfortunately, she had been raped before, and while her previous rapist went to jail, she found the experience to be so horrifying that she opted not to pursue Olsen with the police.
Oh, that's awful. I mean, for her, not like awful that she didn't do it, but the whole process is that
Well, I think that's why a lot of
traumatizing.
victims are re-victimized by other people because they know they have been raped and they target them on purpose.
Yep.
Yeah, I think a lot of what I learn about Olsen as I'm reading along is when he meets the girls, he's asking questions to find out that they come from broken homes,
Right.
or that they don't like.
I don't
to
have
be
to take
home.
time to groom you. I can
Right.
just.
And how long will it be till you're noticed missing? One of the boys that we talk about later, he asks, "What time do you have to be home?" Just to kind of understand.
What's my window of time?
Exactly. June 21st, Olsen was drinking beer and driving his car when he saw 13-year-old Ada Court. Ada, again, was a child from a broken home. She lived with her mother and was on her way home from babysitting her brother's kids. She accepted a ride from Olsen because she was tired and wanted to get home. As he usually did, he offered Ada a cold beer and some green wake-up pills. She passed out in the back seat as Olsen drove her to an old logging road at Weaver Lake. Does that sound familiar?
Yes, that was the first victim, correct?
Mm-hmm. The one that he informed on the guy.
Right.
That was the same place that her body was discovered. As Ada slept in the back seat, Olsen climbed in with her. He woke her up and took her into the woods. As she walked, Olsen hit her on the head with the hammer. She fell to the ground, and then he raped her and covered her with branches. He then went to his car and found that it was stuck.
Oh my God. I feel like we're in a Twilight Zone from hell with this.
He just keeps reliving.
Oh God.
So he goes and he returns to Ada because his car is stuck, and he finds that she's still breathing. So he rapes her again, covers her with branches, hides her jewelry by a nearby telephone pole, and ends up walking down the hill to go find someone to help him with his car. Ada was reported missing when she never returned home. Police, while not as quick to deem it a runaway, had no evidence that anything went wrong. So again, it was a slow process to get any kind of information about her out to the public. This is about the time they started to realize they had a bigger problem on their hands, that it wasn't just a bunch of runaway kids.
And it's becoming more similar, like blunt force trauma, blunt force trauma, blunt force trauma.
There's starting to be a pattern.
Areas that things are found.
The hard part is they really are separating boys and girls. It's when boys are found, it's usually a homosexual relationship.
Right.
Whereas the girls, they can link together a little faster. On July 2nd, Olsen was leaving work late one night to grab burgers. While on his way out, he saw a young blonde boy named Simon Partington riding his bike in his driveway. He asked the boy if he was interested in a job picking up wood for $5 an hour. He offered the 9-year-old a beer and gave him a special pill and told him it would stop him from getting drunk. He took the boy to a nearby store and disturbingly went in and bought a bag of candy and a tube of Vaseline before taking him to a road at a nearby river. They went to the same field where Christine Weller had been murdered. After he was done, he took off his belt and put it around Simon's neck, putting his foot on his back to leverage as he pulled. He then grabbed his knife and stabbed the boy in the chest. He then moved the body into some bushes, broke the blade off of his knife, and threw it into the river. He filled the boy's clothes with rocks and then threw those into the river as well. Police had to take the disappearance of Simon more seriously than they had with the teens. They had easily dismissed the teens as runaways, but it just wasn't the case for Simon. He came from a religious family who all lived together, and they lived in a nice area. Within hours of the report of the disappearance, search teams gathered looking for him for days. His bike had been found a block away from his home. A witness said she saw a man with young Simon buying burgers. A sketch was circulated, and the sketch looked nothing like Clifford Olsen. The man was attractive, tall, and blonde. To make matters worse, he also abducted, raped, and murdered Simon so quickly that he had had enough time to go pick up the burgers and return to his job site without causing anyone to wonder where he had been. Days into the search for Simon, and nothing was found. The attractive man who was sketched was not leading to any arrests. The entire area seemed to be enthralled with the case and were coming together to search for the boy. Again, police had still not linked any of the murders together. They had a mix of victim genders and kids aged 9 through 16. Some bodies were found, but others were still listed as runaways, so there just was nothing solid as of yet. RCMP Corporal Les Forsyth started to consider Clifford Olsen as a suspect. There was no known link to any of the known victims, but he was recently charged with a sexual assault against a 16-year-old girl named Sarah 1 day after Simon's disappearance. Olsen had tried his usual tactics on Sarah. He offered a job, he gave her a beer, offered pills, tried to take her clothes off, but Sarah wasn't having it. She told him no, so he said she was fired from the make-believe job. He took her to a local arcade and dropped her off on the corner, and she went straight to police. While digging into Olsen, they found that there was a lengthy list of sexual charges against him. Some had been rapes of girls that were dismissed or overturned, but others had been charges dropped for sodomy for a young boy. This was a good lead. He also noted that Olsen didn't live very far from where some of the victims lived. Olsen was brought in for questioning, but without any real connection, they had nothing to hold him on. At least now he was on their radar.
Do you know if he had done, so basically all the charges were dropped and he never did any time for any of the...
No, he did time. If you recall, he spent the majority of his life in and out of jail. Just nothing stuck that long.
But, and not for those more recent
Exactly.
ones. Okay.
So on the people that had disappeared, no one had any idea he was connected to them. The ones that they had found, he was a lead in one person's mind. No one was really listening to him yet.
Okay.
Olsen continued to dangle his sexual partners in front of his wife, Joan. He took a 19-year-old lover named Randy, who began staying with them. When she expressed unhappiness with the situation, Olsen flew into a rage. One day, he raped her in their own house for hours. The next day, he was sweet again, being kind to her and telling her nice things. When Joan walked in to find Randy and Clifford together in an embrace, she decided not to push it because she was scared that he would violently rape her again. A week after Simon was abducted and killed, Randy and Olsen went out driving when they spotted 14-year-old Judy Cosma at a payphone in town. They pulled the car over to her to say hi. Judy actually knew who Olsen was and even said his name when greeting him. Apparently, he had offered her a job when meeting her 2 weeks prior at the same exact payphone. That day, he took her to the job site to prove that he was who he said he was and wanted to get her number to call her later for a job. Maybe he didn't have time that day to rape and kill someone. She didn't have a phone at home, so she wrote her name in his notebook, and she told him that she would meet him the next day at the site. He never showed up. But now he re-entered her life, and the three of them opened some beers and started chatting and headed down to McDonald's, where Judy planned to meet her friends that night. While she was in the bathroom, Olsen told Randy to make himself scarce so he could be alone with 14-year-old Judy. After learning that Judy liked rum, Olsen stopped by to buy rum and Coke for them to partake in. He also handed out his famous pills, and soon Judy passed out. Olsen drove her out to Weaver Lake, the same place where he had taken Ada Court, the very spot where he had hidden her jewelry. Olsen pulled out his hammer and his knife from the trunk and set it near him as he tried to rouse Judy. When she woke, she threw up the pills she had taken, and Olsen tried to coerce her into taking more. Initially, she refused, but when he continued to press her, she took 2 more pills. Judy needed to use the bathroom, so he told her to go behind the car. she continued to be sick, Olsen realized this wasn't going to go as planned. As she told him she was scared and wanted to go home, he punched her until she was unconscious. Then he raped her several times and dragged her body up an embankment and threw her over the side into some bushes. He then walked down so he could continue to terrorize her. She was still breathing, so he took his knife and stabbed her in the throat. Olsen was aware that police were taking notice of the child murders, so in order to make it look different, he thought he should stab her body more. He also took the time to sweep away tire marks, gather up her clothes, and pick up the pills from Judy's vomit before leaving the scene. Judy Cosma was again written off as a runaway. When Corporal Forsyth heard this case come up, he was even more convinced that their eyes should be trained on Clifford Olsen. He had now paired up with another RCMP officer, Fred Maley, and explained to him why they should be watching him. He had loads of arrests, convictions, and sexual assault accusations on his record, but he was also very obviously bisexual, which could explain the victimology. He felt strongly that they should arrest him on lesser charges, question him, and put him under surveillance. When presenting this to the Mounties, they did not approve surveillance. They did, however, agree to keep a closer eye on him, build a profile, and then maybe consider surveillance. Maley, convinced that Forsyth was onto something, set out to locate Olsen. When speaking to a family friend, he realized the family had gone to California for travel. Then the friend told him that she was actually surprised his wife was still with him because he, quote, constantly touched babies and children.
Oof. Was there anything in your research as to why they were so dismissive? You know, if you have a police officer saying, this guy's looking really good to me, was there anything more than just, no, we'll get to it?
I don't think they were all dismissive. I just don't think they felt like they had enough to be able to push that much money into a single person. Also, primarily his victims were teenagers, and people were constantly writing them off as runaways. This was like the nature, and I think they have something like 500 people a day go missing in Canada. I should probably fact check that number.
Right.
But it's just really common, so they don't have enough people to look into every
to put
single
the time,
missing
money, and
case.
manpower into
Right.
this one guy.
So until the bodies started coming up, and then they're realizing, okay, this is not runaways. We have a killer, perhaps, one killer on the loose. Then they started listening, but I don't think he was entirely dismissed. There was definitely people on his side. They just weren't willing to invest, thousands of dollars to put full-time surveillance on him yet. Meanwhile, on their trip to California, Joan was finding out just how cruel Clifford could be. She made the mistake of telling him that she was saving up money to pay her father back for some money they had borrowed from him. He demanded it from her, a sum of $4,000. She refused. When she ran out to run errands and left Clifford in the hotel with their son, she came back to find the baby crying and covered in blood. He had a clear knife cut on his chest. When she inquired with Clifford what he had done, he simply replied, "Wire for the money, Joan." This wasn't the only time on the trip he threatened her. So while they were out in the pool one day, he pushed the baby underwater and then pulled him out crying and then said, "Wire for the money, Joan." So she went and got him the money.
Jeez, what a scumbag.
Psychopath.
Beyond.
Yes. It's his own child.
Yeah. Oof.
I know. That's
Fun story.
The cold repeat line, too. I think she's starting to realize what she had married into by then.
Yeah. But yeah, and it's too late because now that cycle of abuse has gotten to the point of you're stuck in it, and now I'm scared of him, and I'm going to get hurt, and I have to, yeah.
And I don't believe she was working at this time. He was supporting the entire family.
Yeah, so he's utilizing that fear and control to be like, well, you're stuck.
Yep.
Get me the money.
We see that time and time again. People don't feel like they can leave. And she actually stuck with him too for a long time after he was arrested even. So she knows he's in and out of prison. He's clearly not a great person,
right,
but she loved him very, very much.
Well, and that's that psychological abuse as well of, staying.
The family headed back to BC after the California trip. Olsen had a new prescription for his green pills on July 23rd. That afternoon, Olsen was out looking for a kid when he spotted a teenage boy near the Salvation Army. He inquired why the kid wasn't at work, and he told him he couldn't find a job. He then told Raymond Lawrence King Jr. that he had a job just for him. He wanted him to be his carpenter's helper for $10 an hour. Ray was excited and quickly got into his car. Olsen explained that they had to go pick up his tools and then they would stop at a phone so he could call his family and tell them that he had a job, which he did. He called his sister. As they drove away, Olsen offered Ray a beer and before stopping, grabbed some whiskey and 7-Up. He then had Ray hand him his wake-up pills, as he called them, and asked if he wanted a few. Ray was soon asleep in the back of his car and on the last drive he would ever go on. After raping the unconscious boy in the back of the car, he drove him out to where he had left Judy Cosma's body. While Ray lay inebriated and talking to Olsen, Olsen took a nail and a hammer and put the nail right into the side of Ray's head. He didn't die right away, but he laid there taking deep breaths. Olsen decided he would rape him again before throwing the boy down a gully and rolling large rocks on top of his body. Ray was expected home, and by 9 p.m., his father was already out looking for him. Though Ray had called his sister earlier that day to tell her he had gotten a job, he didn't say where or for what company. One day later, on July 24th, 18-year-old Sigrun Arndt was visiting a cousin in Coquitlam. She was part of a group of German students on a 3-week tour of British Columbia. As she stood outside on a corner, Clifford Olson drove by and spotted her. He slowed to ask the girl where the employment office was located, but she told him she was visiting from Germany and wasn't sure. He offered to give her a ride back to where she was staying in Burnaby. Olsen bonded with the girl, telling her all about his German friends, the Kleinschmidts, if you recall them earlier.
I do.
When Olsen had trouble pronouncing her name Sigrun, she suggested he call her Sue, like some of her friends. Olsen took Sue out to get beers before telling her he wanted to show her something. He then handed her a beer that he had put green pills into and took her out to the peat bogs and parked the car near the railroad tracks. He brought her outside where he then hit her in the head with his hammer. He hit her so hard that her glasses flew off of her head. He then stripped her down and got on top of her. Just then, a train came by with a brakeman jogging behind it. Olsen and the brakeman actually saw each other, making direct eye contact. Olsen lifted his hand and waved, and the man waved back. Little did he know that Olsen was raping a young girl. The girl woke after he raped her, and then he hit her several times before she died. He pushed her body into a ditch that was partially filled with water and left her there. No one ever noticed Sigrun was missing. Her tour group thought she had gone off on her own. Her body was found several weeks later, and once identified, her family in Germany was called and told the news. They thought she was still off enjoying her time in Canada.
I know every death, especially a teenager, is horrific, but there's something about an exchange student to me. I think maybe because I grew up, we always had dozens of them around.
Isolated almost.
And something about the idea of the family being on the other side of the world, feeling lost and helpless, and then here you are trying to be a host country, and you know, that's what happened to your child. You think you're sending them off to this experience. There's always something that's been extra bothersome in a way to me.
In one of the books I read on this, Predator, it goes into detail about how he convinced this girl that he was a safe, friendly Canadian. I mean, he took her to a local bar where he knew some of the construction workers that went there and was like exchanging jokes with them because he was really stealing equipment and selling it to them for cheap. So they thought,
So they're all
this guy,
buddy.
So she's thinking, oh, this wonderful, friendly
Popular
Canadian
guy.
Yeah, just showing me a good time, wanted to give me a ride. I'm new in this country. So, I mean, it was over the course of several hours that he is gaining this trust with her. And we see that with a lot of killers. And I always refer to Tommy Lynn Sells because he's just the creepiest. He had a way with people. He had a charisma. And you could see in those videos with him and Dr. Stone, you know, making him laugh, making this doctor laugh who knows very well what this guy is capable of. And I see a lot in common between Clifford Olson and Tommy Lynn Sells, just that ability to sneak on in and make people like you. And then just like that, you turn on a dime and you're this monster. It's just, it is very sad. She's so alone. I think it's really sad, though, about her family had no idea. They just thought she was so busy having fun that she wasn't sending postcards. From her. Yeah. Just that shock of realizing your worst nightmare, your daughter off traveling on her own, is never going to come home. It's just very unsettling. I mean, all of these are clearly very unsettling, but the next day, July 25th, a group of kids out hiking discovered a body. Upon autopsy, it was confirmed to be Judy Cosma. She wasn't a runaway after all. Media noted that the body was discovered in the same area where Gary Marcoux's victim, Jean Douve, had been discovered. But Gary was still in prison, so it couldn't be him. If only they had someone who had a keen knowledge of Gary's crimes. Y'all remember Gary? I know it was a while back. He's the one that was in prison with Clifford Olsen and described his crime.
Oh, that's
and
right.
then Clifford knew every single detail, knew where the body was, and helped the police with that one. 2 days after the discovery of Judy's body, 15-year-old Terry Lynn Carson was at a bus stop waiting to be taken to a local pet shop to apply for a job. Olsen pulled up to offer her a ride, and once she was in the car, he handed her a beer and some green pills. He ended up driving her nearly 100 miles away in the mountains. While on the drive, he pulled off of the highway and he raped her. While in the act, he hammered a screwdriver into her skull. Apparently, even after doing this, she was still alive. And as if to prove that there was still room to grow into a more horrific monster, he threw her body into a ditch that was filled with water and stood on top of her until she drowned to death. Terry Lynn's mom called her daughter's friends when she didn't arrive home as expected. Her friends noted that she had never showed up to the pet shop where they were all supposed to meet. She called the police the next morning to file a missing person report. Of course, the police questioned that maybe she had run away and claimed she'd probably turn up. They were wrong. Now that most of the Mounties were starting to realize that Olsen was their best suspect, they compiled a surveillance team to begin keeping tabs on him. He finished up his day killing a young girl, getting a car wash, and then came home for a shower. The surveillance team saw him arrive, then promptly ended for the night because no one had a budget for 24 hours. Oh, yeah.
So they were at his house and watched him get home.
Yeah.
And he's coming home after murdering someone.
Yep.
And they're like, well, he's home.
Now we know where he's at.
No one murders in the daytime.
Exactly.
Just another one of those missed opportunities sliding right by.
People were taking notice. The family of Darren Johnsrud were speaking out, noting that there was a killer on the loose targeting children. They started putting posters up over every neighborhood in the area. Police were getting frustrated with the family, but as terror grew stronger, people felt like there was nothing they could do, and at least the family was doing something. The team assigned to follow Olsen wasn't having very good luck. In fact, the Mounties claimed that Olsen had to be onto them because he was impossible to follow. They would later learn that he had no idea he was being followed.
They're just bad at it.
They're bad at it, and he is all over the place.
I like picturing them being actual mounted police.
Horses.
And they're trying to
keep
catch
up with him in his car.
He keeps getting away.
Eventually, Olsen was arrested for contributing to juvenile delinquency because him and his old pal Randy had picked up a few boys and girls who were out hitchhiking. This didn't sit well with the special team that had been tailing them. They seemed to want him to lead them to something as horrific as murdering a child. But instead, he was arrested, and before they got to that step, he was out of jail by morning. As Olsen went about his normal life, pulling over to kids and chatting them up, the surveillance team followed and watched. He didn't do anything more than be a creep for a couple of days, so on July 30th, the surveillance team was called off. That very day, 17-year-old Louise Simone Marie Evelyn Sharthand was murdered. Louise moved to the area with her sisters from Quebec. While the girls were incredibly close, it was just the three of them. Louise lived with one of her sisters and her child. Louise hitchhiked to a town a few hours before her shift at a restaurant job. Olsen pulled right up and asked the girl where the employment office was. She pointed out where it was and noted that it was closed already. So he went on to tell her that he was looking for girls to clean rugs for his company, and she learned it paid twice as much as her restaurant job. So she hopped in the car with Olsen, where he quickly gave her whiskey and pills. Soon she was drowsy and he was driving her to an abandoned gravel pit. As she passed out in the back seat, he climbed in to rape her while she was unconscious. She later woke and Olsen pressured her to have sex with him. Once they were finished, he took out his knife and hammer. Louise spotted the knife and began to fight him off. He pushed the knife up against her throat and blood started to trickle down her neck. Several times she accused him of planning to kill her, but each time he would convince her that wasn't the case. He then tied her hands behind her back with his belt and eventually took her outside to urinate, and while she crouched to do so, he brought the hammer down onto her head. He pulled it out of her skull to find that she was still breathing, so he covered her with sand and gravel and left her to die. On August 5th, 1981, reports of something dead at Weaver Lake were being called into the police. This was the same location where police had found Judy Cosma, so they sent officers and search dogs immediately. Dogs found a deceased male in the gravel of a ravine. Dental records indicated the body was Raymond King. An autopsy showed police what kind of horrific killer they were looking for, someone who would put a nail into a child's head. Surveillance was back on Olsen by August 7th, and by August 12th, he was driving a rented car near the ferry to Vancouver. Along the way, he picked up female hitchhikers and committed some petty thefts, so Mounties were rightfully on edge. They followed Olsen to the woods where he parked his car with 2 girls. The Mounties didn't want to push it any further, so they decided to intervene. Instead of catching Olsen brutally murdering someone, they found him drinking alcohol with the girls. He did, however, try to make a break for it, but they caught him and arrested him, and ended up arresting him on 2 counts of breaking and entering and contributing to juvenile delinquency. By August 25th, Olsen was also arrested for the murder of Judy Cosma. Olsen wasn't telling authorities much, but they were positive he had killed more kids than just Judy Cosma.
So how did authorities finally pin him for Judy's?
Well, I don't know if you recall earlier I mentioned he had picked her up at the phone booth, and she had written her name in a notebook that he had. So after they found her and they were kind of onto him, they likely had a search warrant, and they found the notebook.
Oh, and
so there was an easy connection between the two. So that, I think, there is a lot of details around the crime that I think they could connect him, but that one was a big red flag. Olsen, ever the tit-for-tat information type, wanted money. This is when the money for bodies controversy comes into play. Olsen tells authorities that he'll confess to 11 murders, giving them any location they hadn't found yet, but he wants money in exchange. It isn't for him, of course. He wants it for a trust for his wife and son to take care of them since he's going to go to prison for the rest of his life. In an unheard of move, the RCMP agrees. They offer him $10,000 for each victim he can confess to and give the locations for, up to $100,000. In January of 1982, Clifford Olson pleaded guilty to 11 counts of murder and was given 11 concurrent life sentences. Can you just process that for a moment?
I mean,
how is that fair?
But life is life. It's not like they're going to...
Not in Canada, which we will talk about.
Well, then keep talking so I can get enraged about it.
He was sent to the Special Handling Unit in Saint-Anne-des-Plaines in Quebec. Now, the families of the victims were clearly not pleased with this payout that authorities agreed to, so they fought against it. Many people felt that the families themselves should be the ones to get the money. The RCMP stood by their decision, saying that had they not done that, they would have never solved these cases. They would have had one.
That is tricky. And, you know, the child and wife are also victims.
That is true.
And so here's hoping that they can take that money and move on and start a new life now that this monster's out of it.
But then it sets this weird precedent where any other serial killer out there...
I can stay quiet and wait till I get the big payout. And yeah, then it's, do we do half the money goes to the family and the other half goes to all the families, or they get paid based on their own child? You know,
in the U.S., you don't see payment. You see an exchange of leniency. So they might get less time in prison, or they
location.
Might go to a specific prison, or maybe they get a TV in their cell. Who knows what it is? But there are ways around this. So I think that's why people were so enraged. But to their point, these were children.
Yeah.
And they knew he'd done something. They just didn't have the bodies. Once he moved back into prison, he gained a new nickname. He was no longer referred to as the Rabbit, who quickly maneuvered to escape prison whenever possible. Now he was simply called Skinner, a term reserved for the worst of the worst, child rapists who kill their victims. Alisha, I can't believe I'm going to say this, but I think we should pause right here.
I 100% agree.
It's a lot of content. The episode will get very long if we don't. And we have a nice little surprise in part 2.
So are you saying that maybe, especially since everyone's just in quarantine and needing stuff to do, that next week we release a second part to this episode?
Yeah, I think so.
Well, hot dog, let's do it.
But you know what else?
What?
We're going to have something new every week in April.
Every single week?
Every single week. So catch us
What a
next
time.
week, y'all.
You ready, darling?
Yeah.
Let's roll. I don't think you're wrong. Look out for poop in the hall.
I got it.
You never know.
Come here, hen.
It's like kids in the hall, but with poop.
Okay. Baby. God, now I'm going to do that. You always do that. Now I'm going to start saying it.
Yeah, it's really fun. That's why.
Baby!
Yeah, baby.
Baby.
Yeah, no, it's baby.
Baby.
It's baby.
Clifford. Whoops. Yeah, that's his name.
Good start. Frank.
Debbie wasn't. I can't believe I didn't put her last name in.
Get away. Go.
I think you might have wanted to put from hotel to hotel.
You're right.
Yep.
It's written right there. Which I believe I said.
You did.
Okay.
I said it just. I've never heard. I never heard it said that way. Sorry.
Okay, Hugh Grant, calm down.
Oh my God, that was very-
I'm so sorry.
This is the beginning of a life of psychiatric. So the officer was like, okay. Because eventually oh my God. Emily, get it together. Police likely searched his bags and...
Well, you might as well jump out the window.
You're right. Open it up for me, please.
No,
My arms are sore.
the glass will help to expedite the process.
Police likely searched his bags, and when they were there... No, this is like the worst sentence I've ever written.
Read it. Read it as it's written.
Mm-hmm.
No, I just did, and I'm realizing how bad it was.
Oh, yeah. No, it wasn't even a sentence.
I took a certificate in taste testing, basically measuring
You're like,
people's...
that's yummy. Oh,
No, like the types of skills you...
Because you're going to say escapades.
I was.
And then
you say escapades?
escapades.
Certainly hope so.
Check the tape on that one.
All day escapade, baby.
What? I just got a sliver.
From what?
No one knows. This is so funny. I've just got to get it right. I'm not going to read what I wrote.
Just walk us through your process, man.
I love it. Watching the sausage get made.
Way to give him a pillow, Josh.
Oh, he's gonna lay down now. Look at. Let him do it. He's gonna do it. I know what dogs want.
I know what dogs want. I know what they like. Henry? Mm-mm. No.
Everyone's just shaking their heads. Makes me tired to be cold. Ew. Why are you smelling your
It's
fingers?
the dog food. I had to know. Olsen was back out of jail and he had lots to do. First, he needed to get more chloral hydrate pill. Chloral, not coral. It's not a singing a singing pill. A singing hypnotic pill.
You sound insane.
It's singing hypnotic.
Who had separated parents and lived with her grandmother, Jewelry. That's not her name.
It's jewelries.
It's Jewelry's. Girl who lived with... No, oh my God. It's over again. My career is so short-lived. Who had separated parents and lived with her grandmother, Jewelry. Oh my God. I said it so serious. So serious.
Is it Julie?
It's Julie.
And I called her Jewelry twice.
100% conviction you said that with.
Yes, absolutely.
I was
Yeah.
on.
Her grandmother jewelry.
I was on.
Is that a t-shirt?
Yes.
It's just that the potential. It's like there's a loaded gun in the house. Go ahead.
Yes. Yes. The fuse is lit.
And the bullets are barks.
and no, here I go again on a total downward spiral. Her grandmother jewelry.
Yes. I can't. Wow, Em, that was great.
I just get so serious, and then it comes
jewelry.
You sure your name's not Jewelry, ma'am?
Oh, that's so good. That's so great.
Murder in the Rain is produced and edited by Josh McCullough. Written and hosted by Emily Rowney and Alisha Holland. Artwork by Jamie Costa. Music by Kai Pfeiffer at kyfifer.com. Check out our website, murderintherain.com, for additional information on all cases, a fun interactive map, and be sure to subscribe so you can receive our newsletter. Check out the Mad Props page for coupon codes from some of our sponsors. We love your reviews and seeing them on all streaming platforms, especially iTunes. And check us out on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. And suck my balls.
Please put that in.